Soy Blanca Uceta O'Leary y en el nombre de San Miguel Penn les doy una bienvenida de la presentación esta noche de San Miguel Penn Winter Series de Francisco Cantú. Francisco Cantú es un becario Fulbright de Tucson, Arizona, quien a los 23 años, sobre las objeciones de su madre, se unió a la patrulla fronteriza para comprender mejor las realidades de la frontera. Su libro, La línea convierte en un río los despachos de la frontera, se publicó en el febrero pasado y logró un gran éxito de ventas. Las memorias de Paco Cantú relatan su tiempo como agente de la patrulla fronteriza de los Estados Unidos desde 208 a 212 en Arizona, Nuevo México y Texas. El libro es el testimonio y detalla su papel en los actos contra los migrantes sancionados por el gobierno y le explora el impacto emocional que esto le produce. Cuando la autora Sandra Cisneros me recomendó este libro, mi primera reacción fue que yo no estaba interesada en leer un libro de un autor latino que defendía los esfuerzos de la patrulla fronteriza, pero Sandra me aseguró que definitivamente este libro no era un libro de porristas. Como yo crecí en la ciudad fronteriza del Paso, Texas, la patrulla fronteriza me detuvo y me acosó con frecuencia y me trataban duramente mientras yo caminaba de casa a mi casa vestida en mi uniforme de escuela con mi mochila llena de libros. Así que cuando yo misma leí mi libro, descubrí que era una joya. Es un libro importante, bellamente escrito, que aborda uno de los temas más espinosos de nuestro tiempo. Sandra Cisneros escribió del libro: hay una línea que divide lo que sabemos y lo que no sabemos. Algunos ven el mundo desde una orilla y otros desde la otra. Cantú los une a un todo espiritual. Mi gratitud por esta obra del alma. El periodista y autor Alfredo Corchado escribió con elegancia que la historia de Francisco Cantú es un viaje lírico que ayuda a salvar la línea irregular que nos separa de ellos. Su empatía nos recuerda a nuestra humanidad, nuestra historia de inmigrantes y en un momento muy crítico. Francisco Cantú es un ensayista ganador del premio Pushcart que recibió el premio Whiting. La línea se convierte en un río fue elegido como el libro de los 10 mejores de 2018, tanto por NPR y por el periódico Washington Post. Thank you for being here tonight to support the work of San Miguel Penn. I am Blanca Uceta O'Leary, and on behalf of San Miguel Penn, I welcome you to tonight's San Miguel Penn Winter Lecture Series presentation by Francisco Cantú. Francisco is a Fulbright Fellow from Tucson, Arizona, who at age 23, over the objections of his mother, joined the Border Patrol to better understand and grapple with the ugly realities of the border. Francisco wrote the book, The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border, which was published last February and which became an instant New York Times bestseller. Paco's memoir recounts his time as a U.S. Border Patrol agent from 2008 to 2012 in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, enforcing immigration policies he opposed. The book bears witness and details his role in the government-sanctioned acts against migrants and explores the emotional toll it took on him. When I first heard about the book from author Sandra Cisneros, my first reaction was that I would not be particularly interested in reading a book by a Latino author who was championing the efforts of the Border Patrol. But Sandra assured me that it was definitely not a cheerleading book. Having grown up in the border town of El Paso, Texas, I was frequently stopped and harassed by the Border Patrol, who harshly questioned my citizenship as I was walking home in my high school uniform with my backpack full of books. When I actually read the book for myself, I discovered what a gem it was. It is an important, beautifully written book that tackles one of the thorniest subjects of our time. Sandra wrote the following about Paco's book. There is a line dividing what we know and do not know. Some see the world from one shore and some from the other. Cantú brings the two together to a spiritual whole. My gratitude for this work of the soul. Journalist and author Alfredo Corchado wrote elegantly that Francisco Cantú's story is a lyrical journey that helps bridge the jagged line that divides us from them. His empathy reminds us of our humanity, our immigrant history at a critical time. Francisco Cantú is a Pushcart Prize-winning essayist who received the Whiting Award. His book, The Line Becomes a River, was shortlisted for the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction and is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle 2019 John Leonard Prize. The Line Becomes a River was chosen as a top 10 book of 2018 by both NPR and The Washington Post. Please help me welcome tonight's San Miguel Pen's Winter Lecture Series author, our friend Francisco Cantú.
Hola, buenas noches. Quiero agradecer a todos los voluntarios de PEN por invitarme aquí y a todos ustedes para asistir esta noche. Y también quiero reconocer a Sandra Cisneros, tal por el reconocimiento que ha recibido por el premio de PEN, tal como para todo lo que hace para los escritores jóvenes como yo. Es una gran maestra, siempre está apoyando los nuevos escritores y yo creo que por eso también merece un fuerte aplauso. Y quiero reconocer también a la tierra de Guanajuato, porque aquí estudié como intercambio en Guanajuato, la capital, y fue para mí un bonito, pues un lugar muy importante. Aquí aprendí cómo hablar el español, el idioma de mis antepasados, y pues me hizo reconectar con la historia de ellos. So now I'll introduce myself in Spanish, or sorry, in English. I just want to thank PEN for inviting me here, for the important work that they do in this community. They're all volunteers, they don't get paid. And I also want to thank Sandra and acknowledge her not just for the prize that she received today, but also for all that she does for young writers like me. And you know, Sandra, it's not just me, is sort of famous for helping young writers of color, women, have their voices heard and come speak in front of audiences like you. And I also want to give a little shout out to Guanajuato as a place and as a state and as a landscape, because it's here that I first studied abroad in Mexico when I was in college. And it's here that I became almost fluent in Spanish. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, and so you know, the time here was really important to me because it allowed me to connect with my ancestors and my ancestry. So I'm very happy to be here. And so I want to share with you all tonight some of my thinking about geography, psychology, and policy in the US-Mexico borderlands, where I come from. And I'd like to begin by actually introducing the idea of psychogeography, which, as I have come to understand it, is a term that first came out of the situationist movement that began among the French avant-garde in the mid-1950s. So among this movement's central tenets was the so-called theory of the dérive, or the theory of drifting. This theory maintains that one way to break free from dominant modes of capitalism, art, aesthetics, and social alienation is to simply walk, wander, and drift through environments in a way that is, quote, playfully constructive. So the idea is to be attentive to a place without being tied to any specific preconceived notion or purpose for it. It is a way to, quote, study the specific effects of the geographical environment, whether consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So in other words, by engaging in alternative forms of exploration and mapping, we can actually become attuned to the psychologies that are imparted by and imparted upon distinct geographies, that is, places and spaces that are both natural and man-made. So halfway across the world and half a century after the Situationists first developed these ideas in France, they inspired the writer David Dorado Romo to begin drifting through unknown corners of his home cities of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, with the fake notion of someday authoring a psychogeography of this US border metropolis. His project eventually became the book Ringside Seat to a Revolution. And in this book introduction, David Dorado Romo writes that during the course of his wanderings, he began to wonder why so many of the dramas that have played out on the US-Mexico border had been completely excluded from mainstream narratives in both American and Mexican history. Why, for example, does every school child in the United States learn of Rosa Parks and her refusal to move to the back of the bus, but not of Carmelita Torres, who, when crossing the border into the United States on the El Paso Juarez trolley in 1917, refused to get off in order to be deloused by immigration authorities, a process that required being bathed in kerosene and having one's head completely shaved. Maybe, Dorado Romo writes, this is because the history of the border has never been considered a truly American history. People who live on the border, he explains, are unclassifiable hybrids, and those who cross it are, quote, people on the margin, claimed neither by America, nor Mexico, nor whichever other country they may be fleeing. So I want to speak tonight about the psychogeography of the US-Mexico boundary, about the psychologies that have been imparted by it and upon it, and in doing so, I'll also be speaking at length about border enforcement and policy, about migration and migrants, about the way different groups of people cross the border, and the ways different people die and are remembered there, or are not remembered at all. I will also be speaking about anonymity, about whose lives are recognized, who on the border is named and unnamed. And I'd like to begin by talking about something that in recent months has dominated news coverage in both the United States and Mexico, the migrant caravan that made its way last year from Honduras to Tijuana, a journey across half of the continent, made mostly on foot, and one which is being repeated as I speak, as another caravan is traveling across central Mexico. So in the US as well as Mexico, perhaps unsurprisingly, there was an overwhelming amount of misinformation swirling around this migrant caravan, exacerbated, of course, by the fact that its arrival happened to coincide with the US midterm elections and the inauguration of a new president in Mexico. So before proceeding any further, I think it's important to dispel of some of those myths. First of all, migrant caravans are not something new or unique to this particular political moment. They've been happening on an annual or semi-annual basis for 15 years or more. They have never been funded or organized by billionaires like George Soros, but they are instead organized by small nonprofit and migrant advocacy groups. In general, these caravans are comprised not chiefly of labor migrants seeking to illegally circumvent the border, but of people who plan to legally present themselves as asylum seekers to US customs agents at designated ports of entry, which is, of course, a completely legal process. Contrary to the tweets of Donald Trump, these caravans are not comprised of criminal gang members or, quote, unknown Middle Easterners, but of people fleeing violence in their home countries in Central America. And as a matter of fact, As many as 2/3 of the caravan that made its way to Tijuana last year was actually made up of women and children. So caravans, it should be understood, have formed largely in a response to the dangers that have grown out of the United States' increasingly militarized border enforcement. As the US border has become more difficult to cross, it has also become more expensive, and smuggling fees have accordingly grown by exponential measures. So much that many migrants enter into debt the moment they leave their doorsteps, a debt that will follow them whether or not they are successful in making it across the border, and that will irrespectively continue to grow with criminally high interest rates, hovering over them for years or decades to come in a way that is far more fearsome than the student loan debt familiar to many young Americans. As trafficking undocumented people across the US border through the interior of Mexico has become more and more profitable, the human smuggling trade has come to be dominated by Mexico's highly organized drug cartels. People for whom extortion, bribery, kidnapping, rape, and ransom are all acceptable tools for maximizing profit and subjugating clients through terror. Caravans are thus a way for migrants to band together in safety, to find protection in numbers, and to avoid giving over their life to a future of debt. But what I really want to call attention to in relation to the migrant caravan is actually 2 migrant deaths. One that took place last year during the caravan's passage through Mexico, and as a point of contrast, a far different death that was witnessed by me many years earlier in the Arizona desert, during the time when I worked as a Border Patrol agent for the US government. So, last October, I was driving from northern Arizona back to my home in Tucson, and I was listening to a podcast from the New York Times about the migrant caravan, which had only just days before entered Mexico. I was surprised to hear a reporter on the program spend several minutes talking about what was being reported as the caravan's first death, that of a 21-year-old Honduran man who died when he fell off the back of a truck on a highway in Chiapas, not far from the border with Guatemala. After his death, the thousands of migrants that had been traveling with him held a candlelight vigil in his honor in the town square where they had all gathered to sleep that night. On the podcast, the reporter even spoke his name, Melvin Josue Gomez Escobar. At home, I searched for the man's name on the internet, and the first result was a web page made in his memory on forevermissed.com. Subsequent results all stemmed from extensive coverage of his death in the international press. Gomez's body, I learned, had already been returned to Honduras after being shepherded expeditiously through Guatemala by federal authorities. His body had been returned to his family and buried by them only 4 days after his death. I also found countless interviews with his with his father and his mother, 2 parents who were briefly being given the rare opportunity to voice their desperation to the world. Gomez's father took advantage of this small platform to speak to the injustice and lack of opportunity in their home country. Here, there is no equality, his father said. My son studied. He was a humble person. He had a lot of dreams, but here, dreams are worth nothing. Here, you cannot dream. Hearing about Gomez's death on the radio and reading about it online in the English and Spanish language news media, I was made to remember the death of a migrant that occurred 8 years prior to his, in the desert a few hours west of my home in Arizona, not far from a village called Ventana on the Tohono O'odham Nation. At the time, I had been a Border Patrol agent for about 2 years. I had joined fresh out of college with a degree in US-Mexico relations, and I had convinced myself that such a job would give me the opportunity to understand the border more deeply. And I naively imagined that I might somehow become a force for good and compassion within the agency. But now, I found myself for the very first time at the scene of a migrant's death with 2 boys, the dead man's 16-year-old nephew and his 19-year-old friend, both of them from the same native village in the Mexican state of Veracruz. now hovering over the body. These two boys were the only witnesses to the man's death. They told me that after being separated from a larger group of migrants, they had become lost, and shortly thereafter, the man began staggering from dehydration. He soon laid down in the dirt, unable to continue, and the boys went out to a nearby road to attempt to wave down one of the infrequently passing cars, but no one would stop for them. Finally, they put rocks in the road to force the cars to stop, which didn't exactly work, but which did cause passersby to slow down long enough to become alarmed and call the Border Patrol. I distinctly remember the way that these boys milled around the dead man's body and looked out in devastation upon the desert, as if they had been robbed by a faceless criminal. And I remember how they asked me, naively, if they could come with the body to the medical examiner's office, if they could accompany it back to Mexico, if they could bring the dead man back to his family in Veracruz. The answer, of course, was no. And I can still recall how I was made to explain to the boys, as rain clouds gathered in the distance, that they were, in effect, under arrest, that very shortly they would be taken into custody, separated from the body, and transported to a Border Patrol station to be processed for deportation. Their only recourse to reunite with the body of the dead man, I told them, was to explain their situation to the Mexican consulate, and hope that arrangements could be made for his eventual repatriation to their home state. For me, that moment, explaining the vast bureaucracy that awaited this man's body to two bewildered boys who had just watched him die, was the very first time I had been made to articulate out loud the institutional indifference of which I had become a part. With regard to this man's death, it should perhaps be noted that there is no page dedicated to him on forevermissed.com. In response to his death, there was almost certainly no candlelight vigils held in his honor, and it is, in fact, entirely unknown to me whether or not this man's body ever made it back to his village in Veracruz, or how long it might have taken his body to return there, or whether or not his family was ever able to lay him to rest in a ceremony on their native soil. What is certain is that no reports were ever authored about his death in local or international news reports. The press never interviewed his family, and no reporters ever printed his name or spoke it aloud on the radio. I should also mention that until just a few years ago, this man's name remained unknown even to me, one of the few people in the country who had ever laid eyes upon his dead body, and it is here, in fact, that we ought to return to our consideration of psychogeography, for it is only because of a particular map that I ever discovered the man's name. Perhaps some of you have seen or heard of the maps of the Arizona desert that are published by the humanitarian aid group Humane Borders. The various versions of these maps plot the deaths of undocumented migrants who have lost their lives crossing the border in the Sonoran Desert beginning in the year 2000. Through a partnership with the Arizona County Medical Examiner, Humane Borders also maintains a constantly updated and searchable map online where viewers may see the exact location where each migrant body has been found, alongside with other information, such as the name and gender of the deceased, if known, the date of discovery, and the cause of death. Such a tool allows us to comprehend the landscape in a way that is far more grim than the French situationists might have ever imagined. But nevertheless, it does present us with a version of the borderlands that is essential to reckon with. In the book, The Power of Maps, which articulates a modern-day theory of geography, it is asserted that, quote, maps link the territory with what comes with it. A map of the dead, however, instead of plotting physical features, plots points of human departure, what one of my students once called clearly marked ghosts. Faced with these red dotted maps of the dead, we, the viewers, are presented with a profound problem: that the dead have no names, that their entirely dissimilar lives are all represented in the very same manner, and that each individual is recognized only for their dying. In beholding a map of dead migrants, the viewer is also subtly encouraged to see those who have died crossing the desert in the same way that policymakers and law enforcement agents might see them, the way that they are seen by militiamen and human smugglers, as each indistinguishable from the next. But this imposed anonymity and the cruelty of it is, in fact, a defining characteristic of what comes with this landscape for so many. It has become part of the psychological fabric of this geography. So, we might ask, how did we arrive here? How did the vast and beautiful mountains and deserts of our borderlands become a container for so much death and indifference? The borderlands, after all, were not always a liminal terrain. They only became such after the imposition of a political boundary that resulted from war more than a century and a half ago. The modern-day torments that grip this place must thus be understood as part of this history, rooted in principles of conquest, expansion, and empire. In his book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, Native American scholar Jack D. Forbes suggests that the violent historical trajectory of colonial and post-colonial America should be understood as stemming from a particular kind of sickness, what he calls the Wetiko disease. In the language of the Cree people, Wetikos are individuals or spirits who terrorize others through evil acts. Forbes posits that Columbus, the conquistadors, and the waves of colonizers that followed them were all Wetikos, carriers of a cannibalistic psychosis he describes as, quote, the disease of aggression against other living things, the disease of the consuming of other creatures' lives and possessions. This disease has bled into our modern society, Forbes argues, in the form of a population that has been made to be crazy by people who draw for us a map of the world which is ugly, negative, and fearful. On a cultural level, this manifests simultaneously in the relentless move towards militarization and in our blind acceptance of it as an inevitable and necessary outcome. Forbes also writes of the long-standing Wetiko disease to, quote, desanctify places that have been historically regarded as holy, sacred, and beautiful by Native people. He writes that the significance of desanctifying the earth, the animals, the plants, the trees, and even human beings is that the world is made a potentially ugly and very exploitable place. This describes, in part, the mentality that has allowed the 2,000-mile-long border region to be transformed into a vast buffer zone, a geography that has slowly been converted into a tool of enforcement in and of itself, a terrain considered so disposable as to merit being riven by an immense wall, 700 miles of which already exist. Throughout history, up to and including our present moment, the border between the United States and Mexico has constantly been depicted as a place that is out of control, a place overrun by various categories of criminals. We've been told time and again that this is a place in need of enforcement, that these are people in need of policing, that the violence and disorder there must be understood as inherent to the region itself and to all those who are drawn to it. Such depictions have long determined the dominant narrative that holds sway over the nation when words like border or migrant are uttered. A narrative that emphasizes obscure threats to people and places far from the country's frontier, the loss of jobs, the menace of violence, the erosion of a familiar, dominant culture. What most of the nation has been made to look away from, however, are the places most affected by a militarized border, and the people who are most impacted by the very same narratives that have so long excluded their experience. Living near the border means becoming conditioned to a degree of militarization and surveillance that would cause great alarm in any other part of the United States. At immigration checkpoints between distant desert towns, automated cameras snap mugshots of you behind the wheel, and if you look a certain way or fail to answer questions just right, you may be quickly asked to prove your status, to explain your presence, and often to step out of your vehicle while agents search your belongings and invite drug-sniffing dogs to crawl across your car seats. Out on the open highway, you are likely to pass multitudes of green-striped patrol vehicles driving in either direction, often too many to keep count. Signs warn you of danger and advise travel not recommended, cautioning that, quote, smuggling and illegal immigration may be encountered in this area, or, quote, visitors may encounter armed criminals and smuggling vehicles traveling at high rates of speed. Observation towers and trucks equipped with radar and infrared cameras can be seen stationed upon surrounding hilltops, monitoring the desert in every direction. And away from roads, if you are bold enough to go hiking on desert trails, it is not entirely unlikely that you might encounter low-flying helicopters overhead, reporting your location to nearby agents. In the borderlands, you thus become conditioned to living with an ever-present sense of unease, of being watched, of moving through a landscape that has been resignified as a transitional terrain, a place made to exist literally and figuratively at the margins. A place where the ground is aggressively claimed by faraway centers of power, but the people who belong to it and those seeking to cross it are rejected. This is a place that Chicana scholar and theorist Gloria Anzaldúa described as, quote, an unstable, unpredictable, precarious, always in transition space, lacking clear boundaries. A place she refers to using the Nahuatl word for middle space, Nepantla. Living in this liminal zone, she writes, means being in a constant state of displacement. The borderlands have also become a place where citizens are subject to distinct standards for search and detention, and where due process for non-citizens is often unrecognizable as anything that might exist within the American legal system. It has become, for all intents and purposes, a zone of exception. It is a place where migrants are regularly sentenced through mass hearings in which the fates of as many as 75 individuals can be adjudicated one after another in a matter of minutes, after which they are funneled into a burgeoning immigration incarceration complex. It is a landscape often written off as a wasteland that is inherently hostile, without recognition that it has, in fact, been made to be hostile. Violence, we should understand, does not grow organically in our deserts or at our borders. It has arrived there through policy. But how, specifically, did our border become a place where so many migrants are made to die in the desert? How did it become, so to speak, a landscape of red dots? This transformation can be traced back to the 1990s, when Border Patrol chiefs began cracking down on migrant crossings in heavily trafficked urban areas like El Paso and San Diego. Walls were built, budgets ballooned, and scores of new agents were hired to patrol border towns. Everywhere else, it was assumed, the inhospitable desert would do the dirty work of deterring crossers away from the public eye. Doris Meissner, the Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization Services from 1993 to 2000, told the Arizona Republic that during the adoption of this strategy, which came to be known as prevention through deterrence, enforcement officials and policymakers believed, quote, that geography would be an ally to us, and that border crossings would go down to a trickle once people realized what it's like. Of course, migrants continued to cross despite the new dangers of the journey, risking their lives in the desert in ways they had never done before. Even as it became obvious that large numbers of people were risking the crossing, resulting in unprecedented numbers of deaths in increasingly remote corners of the desert, the government did not change course. I will be absolutely frank with you, Meissner told an interviewer when asked to look back on the policy of deterrence in light of migrant deaths. The idea of abandoning any kind of strengthened border enforcement because of that consequence was never a point of serious discussion. Meissner's damning admission on behalf of the government that the sustained loss of hundreds of migrant lives on America's doorsteps each year was not significant enough to reevaluate policy reveals the extent to which the desert has been effectively weaponized against undocumented crossers, And it lays bare the fact that hundreds of migrants who continue to die there every year are, in fact, losing their lives by design. Nevertheless, deterrence-based enforcement has steered the immigration politics of every administration since that of President Clinton, and has resulted in an official tally of more than 7,000 migrant deaths along the southern border between 2000 and 2016, a figure which, it should be said, does nothing to account for the thousands more who have been reported disappeared and never found. Jason de Leon, in his book The Land of Open Graves, argues that the government views undocumented migrants as people, quote, whose lives have no political or social value, and whose deaths are of little consequence. This devaluation of migrant life is not just rhetorical. Last year, investigative reporter Bob Ortega revealed that negligent tallying practices by the Border Patrol had failed to account for more than 500 migrant deaths reported by medical examiners, landowners, and local law enforcement agencies over the last 16 years, leading to a literal erasure of their lives from official records. For most Americans who live far outside the border region, the reality of what happens there has long remained out of sight and out of mind. But today, as we all know too well, politicized immigration rhetoric reaches into every corner of the nation, casting migrants as animals, gang members, and rapists, while linking border security to vague notions of invasion and warfare. This rhetoric represents an essential element of the psychogeography of the border. For just as maps link the territory with what comes with it, language often determines what different groups of people will, in turn, bring to a landscape. Let us consider for a brief moment my former employer, the Border Patrol, an agency whose culture is a product of a very specific kind of rhetoric and militarized thinking. Agents commonly refer to migrants as criminals, aliens, illegals, bodies, or tonks, a term with dubious origins, either an acronym standing for temporarily out of native country, or a slur referencing the sound of a maglite hitting a migrant's skull. All of these terms, no matter their roots, reduce the people to which they refer, rendering them less than somehow fully formed human. Such language perhaps helps agents regard the people they are charged with apprehending as criminals, in the same way that soldiers are made to understand those positioned against them as enemies. Perhaps, in some measure, as an outgrowth of this rhetoric, the Border Patrol has gradually sought and obtained more tools of war in order to carry out their duties, equipping their agents with drones, helicopters, infrared cameras, radar, ground sensors, Humvees, and explosion-resistant vehicles. In turn, their enforcement practices have also become more subtly warlike, diverting crossers through some of the most deadly and difficult to traverse terrain in all of North America, in order to provide their agents with every conceivable strategic advantage over those seeking entry into the U.S. This logic should be understood as being deeply rooted in the dehumanizing rhetoric of war. And as we have seen in recent years more than ever before, how it has helped transform, we have seen in recent years more than ever before, how it has helped transform the border into a permanently militarized zone of exception, where some of the most vulnerable people on earth face death and disappearance on a daily basis, where children and their parents may be met with tear gas or separated from each other and sent to distant detention centers, all in order to send the message, you are not safe here, you are not welcome. In this sense, the true crisis at our border is not one of criminality, but of disregard for human life. To describe what we are seeing as a crisis, however, is also to imply that our current moment should somehow be understood as more horrifying than those that set the stage for it. Moments that have been playing out on the border for a very long time, without ever earning much attention from those who are a comfortable distance away from it. In examining the power of political rhetoric to dehumanize migrants, It is also necessary to consider the ways our discourse dismisses the places and situations they come from, diminishing the very realities of their lives in the first place. In her critique of America's quest for retribution in the Middle East following the attacks of 9/11, the philosopher Judith Butler describes the process of derealization and its discursive power to create, quote, humans not recognized as humans. In explaining how certain lives are not considered lives at all, she turns to the example of obituaries, the primary form through which lost lives are humanized and naturalized in the Western world, the means by which a life becomes noteworthy. Butler notes the glaring absence of any such remembrances for victims of US attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq, the profound unavailability of images, frames, stories, or names. If there were to be an obituary, Butler writes, there would have to have been a life worth noting, a life worth valuing and preserving, a life that qualifies for recognition. The same is true, of course, for migrants who die on US soil, on the very doorstep of our nation, and it is similarly true for migrants all across the globe. The distinct ways that people experience the geography of borders has to do not only with the identities they give themselves as prospective migrants, travelers, or tourists, but also identities that are constructed for them, independent of their personal will or input. In an essay examining the omnipresence of modern borders, British journalist Frances Stornor Saunders argues that documents such as passports and visas are central components to how our society values and recognizes human life. Identity is established by identification, Saunders writes, and identification is established by documenting and fixing the socially significant and codifiable information that confirms who you are. Those who possess such documentation possess what she calls a verified self, an identity formed through and confirmed by identification that is attested to be true. As residents of the first world, we are unthinkingly privileged in our possession of a verified self. It means, if nothing else, that our names are known to history, that our deaths will be recorded. By possessing the freedom of movement, we are unimpeded by the burden of a migrant identity, free from the fear that our lives might become defined by undocumentedness, that they might be pervaded by the constant threat of arrest, deportation, and anonymity. A war on immigration, Saunders argues, can also be understood as a war on the global wanderings of the unverified self. In 2013, shortly after his election to the papacy, Pope Francis paid a visit to Lampedusa, a small Italian island in the Mediterranean, commonly recognized as North Africa's gateway to Europe. This island, only 70 miles from the shores of Tunisia, is a central destination on the world's deadliest migrant route, where more than 20,000 migrants have lost their lives attempting to cross the Mediterranean. During his visit, the pontiff commemorated these deaths with a homily in which he referred to the deceased migrants not as undifferentiated, derealized others, but as family. These brothers and sisters of ours were trying to escape difficult situations, to find some serenity and peace. They were looking for a better place for themselves and their families, but instead they found death. Standing at an altar made from the remnants of wooden refugee boats, Pope Francis looked out over the port of Lampedusa and asked his audience, has any one of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters? Has any one of us wept? He goes on to ask, who is responsible for this blood? Observing that today no one in our world feels responsible. We have become used to the suffering of others. The globalization of indifference makes us all unnamed, responsible yet nameless and faceless. Frances Stornor Saunders calls attention to these words by the Pope in order to highlight the parallel anonymities that have come to define immigration crises across the globe. The privileged are as diffuse and unaccountable as the downtrodden are indistinct and unnameable. The stories of migrants become, quote, infinitely reproducible to the point of abstraction, while the verified masses of the first world remain unseeing and unseeable behind the high walls we have built to protect ourselves from the disordered, unauthorized, unregistered others beyond. As an example of this, consider the story of one migrant named Aurelio. His story is known to us because in 1992, Jorge Durand, a social anthropologist and geographer at Mexico's University of Guadalajara, interviewed him as part of a series of in-depth interviews with Mexican migrants who had experienced the hard journey to the United States. Aurelio had attempted to cross the US border dozens of times, only to be captured and sent home by US authorities on every single occasion. El norte es como el mar, he told his interviewer. The north is like the sea. Aurelio explained that, quote, when I hear people speak of the United States, I'm quickly made to think of the ocean. When one travels as an illegal, he is dragged like the tail of an animal, like trash. I imagined how the sea washes trash out onto the shore, and I told myself, maybe here it's just like I'm in the ocean, being tossed out again and again. What we must understand about Aurelio is that his sense of being regarded as trash, of being lost at sea, is in direct relation to our indifference, to the privileges that have been constructed for us at the expense and exclusion of him and others like him. On an individual level, Aurelio's sense of dismissal is directly tied to our capacity to feel empathy for him. But at the same time, we must also recognize that to feel empathy is not enough. Compassion, Susan Sontag famously declared, is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. The same can be said of empathy. We can imagine Aurelio's pain. We can interpret it for ourselves and perhaps feel something that approaches it. And we can even, as Pope Francis suggests, grieve for him, weep for him. But in the end, our feelings and our tears are useless unless they compel us to act in a way that might someday improve his situation, and the situation of our border that so endlessly grates against him. The truth is, on an institutional level, the policies and structures that have taken Aurelio's body and rejected it time and again will remain in place until we push firmly enough against them, demanding that they be abandoned or remade. Finding specific ways to collectively engage in the direct action that might someday accomplish this is perhaps a subject for another talk. But for us to individually push back against the abstraction of migrant stories, for us to personally reject the dismissal and the erasure of their lives, we might begin by simply grieving their deaths, by speaking their names, by seeing them, hearing them, and amplifying their voices and stories. The Mexican intellectual Sayak Valencia, who hails from the border city of Tijuana, writes that, quote, in order to change the order of things, it is crucial to cease behaviors that ally us with the cult of violence, the same behaviors that are symptomatic of the Huético disease of exploitation. We have to be able to construct meaning around the death of any person, she writes, to make sure the death and the pain of an other cause a shudder in all of our bodies. Indeed, if our understanding of violence and death along the border can become something visceral, then we may begin to feel deep within ourselves, no matter how far we actually live from the border, that what happens there is profoundly unnatural. One of my favorite writers, W.G. Sebald, found himself obsessed in his life and in his art with considering how the violence of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust permeated the post-war culture of his home country of Germany and hovered within the memory of the entire continent of Europe. I spent my childhood and youth on the northern outskirts of the Alps, Sebald wrote, in a region that was largely spared the immediate effects of the so-called hostilities. At the end of the war, he continues, I was just 1 year old, so I can barely have any impressions of that period of destruction based on personal experience. Yet, to this day, when I see photographs or documentary films dating from the war, I feel as if I were its child, so to speak, as if those horrors I did not experience cast a shadow over me, and one from which I shall never entirely emerge. This quote from Sebald is made in respect to historical events that are widely regarded as almost universally cataclysmic, as defining tragedies of the 20th century and of modern history. But perhaps that's what's missing from our understanding of our borders and the migrant deaths that play out there. Our dominant culture has willfully failed to recognize this as a defining tragedy of our time, dismissing it as something that need not weigh upon our conception of history. Sayat Valencia also writes that, quote, naturalizing the conditions of a particular territory leads to mystification and leads us in an acritical and resigned position, negating the possibility that our actions might reshape the supposedly essential nature of the place. Therefore, it is up to us to understand what happens on the border as something monstrous lurking through our history and throughout the background of our own lives. No matter how far we live from the frontier, no matter on what side of it we find ourselves, what happens there casts its shadow over us. It is only by collapsing the distance that separates us from the border, perhaps by wandering or drifting through its physical landscapes as the situationists would have us do, or at the very least by exploring its histories and stories, that we might feel some sense of responsibility to push back against the unceasing negation of its culture and people, against its continual relegation into a hellscape designed to repel migrants and banish them without name into the landscape. Perhaps, then, we should take heart from the somewhat incredible fact that just a few months ago, the name Melvin Josue Gomez Escobar became known to the world despite everything that would otherwise obscure the life of someone in his situation. Instead of feeling fear or bewilderment at the caravans heading towards the border, we might feel encouragement and inspiration that these migrants have found a way to band together outside traditional power structures and socioeconomic mechanisms in a way that allows them the agency to push back against the violence and anonymity that so often defines the migrant journey. As one tiny tool for each of us here to wield against this same violence and anonymity, I would like to leave you tonight with the name of the man whose body I saw all those years ago in the desert. A man whose memory deserves to endure as something more than a red dot on the map. Asuncion Quechupa Hicalchua. May you take his name with you and speak it back into history. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, what was one of the biggest surprises for you in the job of working on the border from what you expected when you first started?
Entonces la pregunta es, ¿qué fue una de las sorpresas más grandes de haber trabajado para la patrulla fronteriza? You know, I think I have to say that one of the biggest surprises was the amazing variety of different people that I met who were doing the job. I was surprised that there were so many Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Hispanic Border Patrol agents. I was, simultaneously surprised by the casual cruelty that I encountered, and I was just as struck by, the deep goodness and compassion that I encountered in many agents. I think one thing about the Border Patrol that is often, forgotten is that it's the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. It's bigger than the FBI, it's bigger than the DEA. And so, when you're talking about a group of people that big, you really do find every kind of person. But I think it wasn't until I left the Border Patrol that I could really see all of the subtle ways that the culture of the institution minimizes and dehumanizes the people that they're encountering every day. The vast majority of people that I encountered, were in humanitarian situations, not situations that had anything to do with anything I could understand possibly as criminality. So I guess that's the biggest surprise. And I'll try to translate some of that. Yo creo que lo que más me sorprendió fue la gran diferencia entre los diferentes tipos de agentes que había. La patrulla fronteriza es uno de los más grandes agencias en todos los Estados Unidos, más grande que el FBI, el DEA. Entonces yo encontraba gente de cada tipo que podía imaginar. Me sorprendió la crueldad, cruelty, la crueldad y también la compasión y la esperanza de hacer algo bueno para los migrantes. Yo creo que encontré las dos cosas, encontré muchos agentes latinos, pero sobre todo hay que notar lo que no podía ver hasta después de que salí del trabajo, que hay una mentalidad dentro de la agencia que deshumaniza a los migrantes.
This is actually a serious question. If you were sitting in the room with President Trump and he asked you for your solution based on your experience, which is terrific, and then all the thought you've given to these issues, what would you tell him he should do?
Resign. La pregunta fue que si yo me encontré en el mismo cuarto que el presidente Trump, que le diría para mejorar la situación de las fronteras, y dije que sale de la oficina, ¿no? Que querían hacer su trabajo. But I should also say in a more serious way, and I don't mean this to sidestep the question, but really I like something that I have had to do in my short adult life is the decision to write a book and to become a writer was also a decision to, in a lot of ways, stop trying to answer the question of how to fix it, of what to do from a policy standpoint, because that was this question that I was obsessed with as a undergraduate in college, and that's part of why I went into the Border Patrol, thinking that I would see something and understand something that would help me fix it. And so I think that as a writer, we each choose and take stock of what our abilities are and choose how best we think we can deploy them into the world. And so I think that the best good that I can do is to encourage people to think about language and rhetoric, and I do that through through writing. So I don't have a policy solution, and I also think that sometimes it can be like a trick for someone on the other side of a position to tell you, okay, well then what would you do? Then come up with a solution. And it's not I don't think it's our job as writers, or even as a regular citizen, to have the answer, but we can see what's happening and reject what's happening and ask for something better, and ask for something better from our policymakers. And so I think that's what we have to be doing at this moment, right? Is reject the rhetoric that we're hearing, and reject all of the terrible immigration reform solutions that are doubtlessly going to come up, if ever that is back into the legislative priorities. Thank you. That's a lot to translate into Spanish.
Okay. We might have time for two more questions.
Okay.
Okay.
The best answer was the first one anyway.
Hi, mine is a very simple question. Had you thought at all before you entered the Border Patrol about the possibility of writing a book based on your experiences?
la pregunta fue si yo había pensado antes de reunirme a la patrulla fronteriza en la posibilidad de escribir un libro. And the answer, I hadn't ever thought about writing a book. I was definitely like already a literature nerd. I thought about writing as this like hobby that would never be a real job. That could never possibly be a real job. I think a lot of writers feel that, especially when they're young. And so I thought about joining the Border Patrol, doing it for a few years, and then going on to be like a policymaker or an immigration lawyer or something like that. And I think I really turned back towards writing after I left the Border Patrol and started to see it as something, very serious that, was deserving of me devoting all of my time and energy to, because it was the only way for me to make sense of like everything that I had seen and done. And I felt like I had only come out with more questions than I entered with. Spending a lot of time with myself in front of a blank sheet of paper or a blank computer screen seemed like the only way to start making sense of it. Entonces, la idea de verdad no me ocurrió antes de haber trabajado eso, aunque yo sí fue aficionado de la literatura. Imaginé que fue más como un hobby, ¿no? Que no podía ser un trabajo real. Pero después de haber hecho el trabajo y salido de la patrulla, yo vi que pues la única manera de entender las cosas que había visto y que había hecho fue a través de la escritura. Entonces yo me puse a estudiar, a trabajar, a leer y a hacer todas esas cosas en una manera más seria.
The last question, I'll give the microphone to Jennifer Clement, International President of Penn International.
Oh, hi Jennifer. I'm so sad I won't be here for your talk next week.
So thank you for such a great talk and your beautiful book. I just have one question. As a Border Patrol agent, how aware were you and your fellow agents of the amount of guns that were coming into Mexico from the United States?
That's a great question. Can I plug your talk? Is it on Friday?
Thursday.
Thursday. Everybody come to Jennifer's talk on Thursday. I will have left by then, so I'm sad to miss it. Entonces la pregunta fue, como agente, si me di cuenta de la cantidad de armas que había fluyendo a través de las fronteras. Because I didn't only listen to like right-wing media like a lot of the other agents that I worked with, I feel like I was pretty conscious of that, and but at the same time, I think that like there was never anything in the training to be a Border Patrol agent. There was never anything as far as like the information that got put out at a station level, or the assignments that we would receive as agents. We were never asked to look for signs of arms trafficking, or which is all southbound, right? Like we ignore every car that goes south. Like it doesn't matter to us. And I do remember that there was an Obama initiative for customs agents who wear blue and work at the ports of entry and at airports. There were customs agents in the areas where I worked that would do a few hours of southbound inspection, where they would set up a checkpoint on cars leaving the United States, supposedly to look for guns. But I think that initiative died with Obama leaving office. Entonces la respuesta fue que en realidad nunca había nada de entrenamiento, nada de pues nada de nada para hacer los agentes pensar en las armas que estaban yendo hacia el sur, aunque sí había una iniciativa por los agentes de los customs, ¿no? Los agentes que trabajan en las puertas de entrada. Ellos sí hicieron inspecciones por algunas pocas horas durante cada día de los carros que estaban yendo al sur, pero yo creo que esa iniciativa se murió cuando Obama se fue de la oficina.
Thank you very, very much.